Tamitakiapi, Lampetuwashte. Welcome to the ICT Newscast. I'm Shirley Snavy. The Liberal Party prevailed in Canada with the election of Mark Carney for Prime Minister. ICT's Jordan Bennett-Begay, our managing editor, is here with Canadian correspondent Miles Morceau.
Thanks, Shirley. Hi, Miles. Thanks for joining us. Mark Carney won the election on Monday. He will be Canada's 24th Prime Minister, and he ran on an anti-Trump platform. And here's what he said in his victory speech.
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never ever happen.
Miles, we just heard in Carney's victory speech his anti-Trump sentiment. Is this what turned a tide in this election for Carney, because he initially wasn't in the lead?
Well, I think it certainly changed the whole election. At the end of last year, with Justin Trudeau in charge, he was behind the Conservatives by some 30 points in polls. And so at the beginning of the year, he stepped down. January 6th, he stepped down as leader. And in March, they elected Mark Carney. And when Carney came on board, he took a very strong anti-Trump position, using the catchphrase elbows up, which is a hockey term for let's get ready to rumble type of thing. So a lot of this rhetoric of we're ready to fight, Canada's strong, Canada will be united to take on, the threats of annexation, the tariff war that's ongoing, the trade war that's happening. And, within a matter of a couple of weeks, they were tied and then leading in the polls. And the race was close, but ultimately Carney and the Liberals did prevail and managed to win a minority government, but they won nevertheless.
How did the Indigenous vote play a part in this election?
Well, because it was so close, it really came down to a handful of ridings that were going to decide whether or not you were going to win, you were going to lose. And again, the difference between majority and minority is huge. The difference is between basically having the power to push whatever legislation you want through. You have that with a majority government. With a minority government, you have to bring other parties, other voices in. And in the last minority government of the Trudeau government, they had an agreement with the New Democratic Party, which is the more left-leaning socialist party here in Canada. And so they had an agreement with them in order to push their legislation through. Well, Carney's going to have to make a deal. And most likely that deal is going to be, once again, with the New Democratic Party, despite the fact that they only have 7 members of parliament. Carney only needs 3 votes. And so it's likely that there's going to be some kind of alliance with the New Democratic Party. And 2 of the 7 MPs that are NDP are Indigenous. Leah Gazan, who won in Winnipeg Centre, and Laurie Idlut, who won in Nunavut. And so those 2 Indigenous women, an Inuit woman and a Lakota woman from an urban riding, they are going to have significant influence, I believe, in this upcoming government.
Well, thank you so much, Miles. And I guess next steps, when do you think we'll see the final results for the elections up there?
I think pretty much all the numbers are in. One of the ones that we were watching very closely was Laurie Idlut up in the Nunavut territory. And again, there's an example of how Indigenous votes in the Indigenous electorate matter here. All candidates from the major parties in that northern riding were Inuit, and so, but we had to watch those results coming closely. And as of earlier this morning, it was 77 votes separated Laurie from for her challenger, but she's back in representing that riding. And as I say, I believe her as well as Leah Gazan will have some influence in this upcoming government. But there were five Indigenous candidates that won seats for the Liberals and some flipping seats. Rebecca Chartrand is one that stands out. She won a riding in northern Manitoba, the Churchill Kiwinotanak Aski riding, which had been held by Nikki Ashton for 17 years, and her father held that riding before her. And so there's been decades that the Ashtons have controlled that riding. And despite the fact that that it has about an 80% of the electorate in that area is Indigenous. This is the first Indigenous candidate for, over 2 decades for sure. And so for Rebecca to come in there to flip that riding, to the Liberals, and every riding mattered in this election, and so that was key for them. Another interesting development was the election of a candidate as a Bloc Québécois member in northern Quebec, and the Bloc Québécois only runs candidates in Quebec, and is really largely focused on issues around separation and Quebec sovereignty and language rights. So for an Indigenous candidate to win under that banner in northern Quebec is also a really interesting development. And so in total, we had 12 Indigenous MPs, which is a historic accomplishment here in Canada. In the 2021, there were 12 Indigenous MPs elected, but one of those candidates who identified as Indigenous, Randy Boissonneau, who was a member of the Liberal Party and was part of Trudeau's cabinet, had to admit that he in fact was not Indigenous and had to step down from his role in cabinet as a result. And so this time around, we do officially have 12 Indigenous MPs in the federal government of Canada.
Oh, a lot going up on North. So thank you so much, Miles, for your time and energy.
Thank you, Jordan.
And back to you, Shirley.
The world's largest gathering of Native leaders, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, will soon have a closing message for the rest of the world. Stuart Huntington was there in New York and has this report.
The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was established in 2002 after decades of lobbying by Indigenous advocates who felt underrepresented at the United Nations. Tribal leaders gathering in New York, including representatives from the National Congress of American Indians.
Good day, my name is Aaron Jones. I'm a member of the Tulalip tribes.
Say there is great value in meeting with Indigenous leaders from around the world.
There's no better way to show, some form of sovereignty and self-determination than having an international relation with another Indigenous peoples, and maybe that can build into trade as well. And, there's really, the possibilities are endless when you're a sovereign nation, and we just want to make sure that opportunity is there and it's not going to be something that's limited. There's no better time to start than now, and finding what is a good best practice or what is an example that works. I think it just takes trying it out. I think we can look at other regions of the world and see, what's happening with the Sami in the Scandinavia, or what's happening with the Inuit in the Arctic Circle, and seeing what we can build on as a best practice. And that's why, a forum like this forum is very important.
The main focus of the 2025 forum is pushing for the implementation of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights first adopted in 2007. UNDRIP calls for tribes to have free, prior, and informed consent on all relevant matters. That call resonates with tribes in this country.
Historically, in the United States, we really had a unilateral system where the federal government could make decisions on behalf of tribes and even negotiate with companies for tribes. But in today's era of self-determination, it's really important that tribes are able to sit down at the table with governments, with companies, with others, and negotiate the elements of those deals.
Other issues highlighted at the forum range from climate disasters to the effects of mining in Indigenous communities, to ensuring equal respect for traditional knowledge alongside scientific research, and also fishing rights.
When we start talking about fishing, we have all these other international vessels that come in and scoop up the fish and leave. And so it's not only a United States problem, but it's an international problem. I'm also on the...
Following the May 2nd closing ceremonies, the 16 members of the forum are tasked with producing a summary of concerns to pass on to UN agencies and members. That report is due sometime later this month. For ICT from Lenape Homelands, I'm Stuart Huntington.
Nitsika tai gitse. Nitsika tai gitse means I feel the good in what you've done. Nitsika tai gitse Nitsikahtai Gitsib. I feel the good in what you've done.
State legislators across the country are wrapping up their sessions. In Montana, ICT reporters were on the ground, tracking how new laws could impact the state's 12 sovereign tribal nations.
The 2025 Montana State Legislative Session is coming to an end, and this year, Indigenous fellow Caden Foreman-Webster has been covering from the Capitol for ICT and Montana Free Press. Thanks for joining us today, Caden.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just talk a little bit about the American Indian Caucus, who consists of the caucus, and what were some of their priorities to start the session?
So the American Indian Caucus this session was made up of 12 different tribal members, and I do believe they represent all of the different reservations in Montana and all of the different tribes as well. This session, major focus, there's essentially 4 arenas. We had child welfare, education, tribal consultation, and MMIP, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And so the biggest priority, Indian child welfare, which got heavily gutted from its original version, but the caucus did say that the most important thing was that they got rid of the termination date from previous legislation and ensured that they got it for the following years, all the way up to 2029, which so far, it hasn't been signed into law yet, but it has passed both the House and the Senate. So it's waiting on the governor's signature, which they're pretty confident about.
Yeah, and Republicans have a supermajority in Montana, both houses, the House and the Senate, as well as the governor's office. What did caucus members say about the importance of working across the aisle to get their legislation through?
It's vital to this session. If they didn't work across the aisle, they wouldn't get any of the bills that they want. And I talked to Jonathan Windyboy, Montana senator, who has been very successful this session. And I asked him, how vital is it to work across the tables? And he says that what he has done is approaches the Republicans that, they're saying they'll never support you in this bill. And he takes that as kind of the objective to go talk to them, get to know them, introduce the Indigenous side of bills and explain it from his perspective.
Yeah, and you mentioned Jonathan Windyboy had a successful session, as well as the Montana Indian Child Welfare Act, and I believe there's legislation passed on Indigenous Peoples Day. Overall, what have you heard from American Indian Caucus members and how successful the session was?
Right now, I think they're very positive going into it. There's still some chances that they're not going to get everything that they want, but from what they have said, it's been a very positive outcome. And what they don't get this session, they said they're going to look into into next session.
Certainly, and we're in the final stretch before the session wraps up. What are you keeping your eye on at the Capitol in these final couple weeks?
So a ton of bills. I think there's 9 of them right now pertaining to Indian country that have passed both the House and the Senate, and they're waiting on the governor's desk for his signature. So Indigenous Peoples Day. Senator Shane Morjo from Salish Kootenai, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes where I'm from, he is the sponsor of this year's Indigenous Peoples Day bill, which I think for the last decade they've been trying to get it through the Montana's legislator and have continually failed. And it's long go of it to get it through. And this session, they focused, instead of it being like Christopher Columbus versus Indigenous Peoples Day, they decided to go with more of an inclusive look at it, where it would be Indigenous Peoples Day and Christopher Columbus Day. Montana, you decide which one you want to celebrate and to do history on. And by doing that, taking that angle on it, they got a lot of bipartisan support, and it made it through both the Senate and the House pretty fluidly, with a lot of bipartisan support to get it through. And then tribal consultation. Specifically, there's a very interesting one. It's in regards to Indian Ed for All, which is, I think it was originally unique to Montana, and I think began in the 90s, and I think other states have also adopted it. But Montana, kind of the leader in that, from what I understand, or at least Windy Boy has been a huge proponent of it, and so that's normally how he goes about it. But it looks to involve more transparency about schools that receive Indian Ed funding and ensuring that the state knows how they're spending it and that it is actually being used for Indian education instead of frivolous spending, which was a big worry of Windy Boy. And that bill is waiting on the governor's signature. And I think the last very interesting bill to pay attention to would be Representative Frank Smith's cannabis compacts. So tribes and the governor's office will be able to enter into compacts very similar to like gaming compacts to hash out taxes, tax sharing, dispensaries, who to sell to, who can buy, all of these different things, which when cannabis was originally recreationally legalized in Montana, the tribes did not get any consultation regarding it. And so proponents really focused on this being the way to address that for the future of cannabis and tribes in Montana.
Great. Well, that's all some very interesting stuff, and sounds like they're going to go right up to the very end. Caden, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's powwow season, and dancers are dusting off their moccasins or hunting for a new pair. University of Montana journalism student Sydney Perkins reports on how one shop owner is honoring Indigenous artists and inspiring the next generation.
Major Robinson opened a pop-up store at the Native American Council powwow in Bozeman, Montana. The shop features Indigenous artists from around the world.
Well, we wanted to not only highlight artists of all different cultures, including Indigenous cultures, but we wanted to show and celebrate the different cultures of Montana.
Robinson says each item they sell has a tag recognizing the artist who created the piece.
We help to tell their story and help to keep their tradition alive. So some of our artists have learned their craft from their grandparents, from their grandfather or grandmother or their parents. We acknowledge those artists by name.
So when people buy something, they're actually taking that story of that artist and knowledge of that artist with them as they travel.
Robinson says he has seen more people embracing Indigenous attire.
This is the first powwow I've noticed this, is that young people, and as well as, more mature people like myself, are expressing their Indigenous fashion and how they wear their clothes.
Robinson says one young customer loved the skirt she bought.
There was a little girl who said, "So when are you going to wear that?" She said, "Every day I'm going to wear this."
Robinson says the logo representing the company is modeled after an Indigenous family friend.
Could we use your image to actually advertise our business? And she said yes, and kind of teared up a little bit.
Robinson says he hopes his store encourages younger generations to embrace their cultural identity. Reporting from the homelands of the Salish, Calypso, and Kasonka people, I'm Sydney Perkins from the School of Journalism at the University of Montana.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, Nikaya Yuhamaniye. May the force be with you.